Today's talk is part of our lecture series, Conversations in Forest History. Our guest today is historian Steve Pyne. Among his many books is America's Fires, a historical context for policy and practice, which is part of the Forest History Society's Issues series. This presentation is entitled Mann Gulch, Norman Maclean, and Young Men and Fire, Why We Are Still Talking About Them Today. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to our guest.
Well, good morning from Arizona. And first, my thanks to the Forest History Society and Jamie in particular for this invitation and an opportunity to talk about what we might call the meanings of Mann Gulch. Let's begin with the fire. Most of you are probably familiar with the basics, but it won't hurt to review the setting a bit and the narrative. There's an aerial view of Mann Gulch about the time of the fire. Here's a more recent satellite version, which helps to set the location. It is right at the gates of the mountains. Helena, Montana would be in the upper right of that image, if that helps you center it. The fire began by lightning near one of the tops of the ridge between Meriwether and Mann Gulch. The fire perimeter at the time of initial attack looked approximately like this, winds carrying it along the upper slopes. The jumpers landed in the upper part of the amphitheater in a grassy area and then began walking down the gulch with the intention of coming up and anchoring in what would be here the southwest portion of the map, and then began flanking the fire. In the meantime, several spot fires formed at the bottom of the gulch. They recognized the hazard that presented, actually an imminent threat to them, and they reversed. And so the last of the crew became first, and they began scrambling up the hillside, up very steep ridge, to try to escape from it. Fatalities, 13 men died, 12 jumpers, and one former jumper who was a recreation guard now, who had joined them from Meriwether, and 3 escaped. And they were all caught by the flames on the slope. 2 escaped, Walter Rumsey and Robert Salee. And they managed, along the rim rock, they found a passage through it while they were scrambling, and then on the other side found a rock pile. Another crewman, William Hellman, also made it through a crevice, but he was badly burned and subsequently died. And a third member, another jumper, was with Sally and Rumsey at the time. But when they took a left turn, go through the rim rock, he took right and was later overtaken by the fire. But a lot of the story hinges on this guy, Wagner Dodge, the crew foreman, and something he did at the site, which was to set an escape fire. With the main fire bearing down on them very rapidly. And we shouldn't forget the noise as well as the visuals of this. He took out a match, lit a fire, actually lit several spots, and then with the intention of moving into the burned area, he tried to signal the rest of the crew to join him, but the noise, the smoke, the confusion, and undoubtedly the adrenaline and whatever else was pumping through them at the times. None of them understood what he intended. This was not something anybody had trained for. And Dodge then lay down in the burned area and survived. And in many ways, this was taken as an ingenious solution, almost a miraculous one, which sort of allowed Dodge to escape in multiple meanings in Maclean's recording of it. But in fact, the practice was very well known. and you can find it globally, especially where grasses are prevalent. And there are many renditions of it, many visuals, as well as accounts. This is a Currier and Ives print from the 1840s, the Trapper's Defense, and you can see the technique was whatever the newcomers, settlers, or in this case, fur trappers knew from their prior experiences, or even in Europe. There was a transfer from indigenous peoples, as shown here, and the technique was very widely used. I just was reading some accounts in Central Asia, and the caravans are doing exactly the same thing. So it's a little more complicated, but clearly for Dodge, this was a new thing, and for his crew. Then set in the retrieval of the bodies. One of the things I find interesting was the use of helicopters at this point, in this case, 11 trips to Mann Gulch to excavate, to remove the bodies. There was some publicity. Life magazine featured a cowboy on its cover, but had a nice spread on the jumpers. Other memorials afterwards, stone crosses. And the enduring memorial, however, is almost certainly will be Norman Maclean's Young Men in Fire, the account. So among the meanings of Mann Gulch, we have to go back to Maclean and what he was thinking about when he wrote it, and what the effect was. And in a sense, he had certain themes, personal obsessions, personal interests, not just with fire, but with larger sorts of questions and with literature. And he found in Mann Gulch a perfect crucible for all these things to come together. He had tried for years to write a manuscript that was based actually on the Little Bighorn and Custer's, the massacre of Custer's troop there, to develop those themes, and was unable to make it work. But at Mann Gulch, it all came together. The place, the timing of the event, the character of the narrative, the role of the fire, all of this converged. And he could draw on his own experiences really as a teenager of fighting fires for the Forest Service while on a trail crew, to bring a kind of woodsman's vernacular to bear on it. Okay. So a lot of claims are made about the fire. It certainly affected lots of individuals, but whether it affected the larger culture and institutions and how we did fire at the time, a little more controversial. This is a simple graph by decade of known tragedy fires, that is multiple fatalities, where at least 4 people were killed in a single incident, dominated by the 6 incidents that resulted in 78 fatalities in the 1910 fires. We don't have great statistics on a lot of this, but we can begin seeing a regular series of these beginning in the 1930s, particularly with the CCC crews. There's Mann Gulch, the number of dead compared with the setting in 1940. The overwhelming number was actually a burnover of a Marine crew in Southern California at Hauser Creek. So here's the setting for fatality fires. And that's where Mann Gulch fits into this. Let me see. And these are fires, 1953 Rattlesnake Fire in Northern California burned over a crew. And 1956, the Anaha Fire in Southern California burned over a crew. And that was what prompted the Forest Service to commission a special review of fireline safety, which resulted in the 10 standard firefighting orders in 1957. So did Mann Gulch play into that? Well, it had to in some ways. And the people who, some of the people who were involved in creating the standard orders, particularly Bud Moore, were familiar with the fire. But the immediate provocation was actually the California fires. Maclean's book was published posthumously in 1992 II. He died in 1990 before it was completed, and his son and others revised it for publication. It was a sensation, a bestseller, won critical awards, and 2 years later, South Canyon fire in Colorado burns over a crew that is eerily similar to what he recounts. And this time, the fires can be interpreted differently, and because they have Maclean's book. And I remember talking with the Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt, a few years afterwards, and he recounted how he had read the book, and then when he heard about South Canyon, immediately went there because he now saw it in different terms than these fires had been seen before. This gives rise to some serious inquiry within the fire community about fire safety, and it also leads to a common federal wildland fire policy in 1995. So did Mann Gulch affect fire safety and policy? It did, but once it had been refracted through Norman Maclean's book. Other fallout, John Maclean, his son, who had helped edit Young Men for publication, took on the South Canyon fire, much as his father had, Mann Gulch, and then this subsequently led to a series of books about involving firefighter fatalities. So that's another consequence. Impact on fire operations. In 2007, a big fire season in the Northern Rockies, the fire boiled out of Meriwether Canyon. About 45,000 acres burned over Mann Gulch and most of the gates of the mountain wilderness. And this time, nobody went in. They dropped a few buckets from helicopters, but they left the fire. They defended the southern perimeter, which had some housing development and some fuel treatments, but otherwise they let it go. And clearly, part of the reason was that nobody wanted to echo Mann Gulch. Impact on fire research. This has been, there are several claims that this was a catalyst for sort of rekindling and invigorating Forest Service fire research. Here's Harry Gisborne, one of the pioneers in the Northern Rockies, very much the forester turned researcher, life of strenuous endeavor. He went to Mann Gulch in November to see what he could learn about a blow-up fire and died while he was there. And he has a memorial. So did this affect fire research? Well, other than leading to Gisborne's passing, not really. The Forest Service was already had a major makeover of its fire research underway post-World War II, and its involvement, interestingly enough, in the atomic bomb tests, which brought the Forest Service and wildland fire into a whole new realm of fire physics, meteorology, chemistry, on a scale that had been unprecedented. So there were observers, Forest Service observers at many of the test sites, many of those that were testing the fire effects of atomic weaponry. And one of the great early works to come out of fire behavior, George Byram's work on blow-up fires, clearly comes out of this research, not out of blow-up fires in the wild, although he applied what had been learned to that. And in 1960, one of three fire labs the Forest Service would created, this one at Missoula. Some of the funding for this came out of military and civil defense. The Forest Service was now involved with the National Academy of Sciences and the National Research Council, which had a special fire committee, which was totally unknown, a scale of research that had not been known before. And clearly that is what gave the extra boost to fire research and modern fire behavior studies. What about fire as literature? There had been very little. Probably the dominant one of recent times, 48 publication, George Stewart, English professor at University of California, Berkeley. Fire, still out there. It's still in some ways a template for fire narrative. This was sandwiched for Stewart by a book on a big storm, so he could go from water to fire, and a book about a post-apocalyptic planet. But generally not. The 1940s, 1942, fire engages with popular culture, first with Hollywood. Bambi is released, and The Forest Ranger is probably the first Hollywood feature film centering on fires and forestry comes out. And so that is part of the backdrop. But more recently, these are all in the last couple of years, the upper row of nonfiction, the lower row of fiction, major writers producing books with national, even international impact on fire. And this, I have to believe that Maclean's book was part of what convinced literate culture and really sort of I use elite, cautiously elite culture to become interested in fire. Clearly, Yellowstone fire, the recurrence of large fires and issues now made fire something of political interest, but how do you treat that as literature? There was very little out there. And we now see major works, and even, let's not forget the genre fiction, the hotshots, romance, whole series of romance books on that. The other thing that's happened is as a result of the book, a reconsideration of these fires, a re-examination of them, beginning with Mann Gulch and exhibits there, interpretive exhibits as well. I think Jamie may show you something on that. Rededication at Nifsey. Even the 1910 fires have rededication ceremonies, and of course, more recently, the Granite Mountain hotshots at the Yarnell Hill fire. All of these are now reconsidered in ways that had not been true before. How were the 1910 fires seen? Well, they were seen mostly as an industrial accident. How were the 1940s and early 50 fires seen? They were seen as really a kind of Cold War battlefield. And in effect, the Forest Service chief at the time memorializes the Inaha fire victims as having died in the service of the free world, fighting the Red Menace, the other Red Menace. Maclean changes that. He also changes the story of of how fire could be seen. For me, in my early efforts in writing about fire and young people, I saw fire in the largest sense as a comedy, literary sense. That is, it was a coming of age story, basically. Maclean changed it into a tragedy and looked for different meanings in it. So the meanings, I think it's also become a kind of pilgrimage site. It's not easy to get to. It's a tough hike if you go up. I did it. The Meriwether fire had closed the entry point at Meriwether Canyon, so I was dropped off right at the mouth of Mann Gulch. There was only one way to go. And going up to the top, I was observed by this small flock of bighorn sheep almost all the way to the rim rock. And this will give you some views of what the panorama looked like. And the trees in the top I sat under. I brought a laptop, which was very unusual for me, and I wrote an essay right there. It was one of the quietest places I've ever been. So for many of us, and this is the Meriwether fire as we came out, reversing perhaps Maclean's experience for the personal becomes cultural. In this case, the cultural significance of Mann Gulch became personal. And I was particularly interested in how Maclean managed to produce, in a sense, a literary blow-up and make such consequences. Anyway, with that, let me leave the screen and over to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Steve. Let's see if I can pull off a screen share very briefly. Let's see. well, there we go. Very quickly. So I've been 3 times. I came in through Meriwether Canyon, and it's about a 6-hour round trip hike. Maclean talks about the James Harrison making that hike from the ranger cabin up. So the steep switchbacks. Now this is from 2009, 2010, 9. And when you get to the top, there's this sign that lays out the events of the day for you. And then you still have to walk the ridge around to even get to the top of Mann Gulch, and then you descend in. I just want to note here that you see or hear this phrase frequently in regards to this fire and others. They did not die in vain. I'll let that speak for itself. So Steve mentioned that he came in through Mann Gulch, the mouth of Mann Gulch. And when you do, you'll encounter the monument memorial to Harry Gisborne. Several years ago, they replaced the crosses on the hills with these pillars, basically, or pylons. I'm not sure what the proper term would be. One reason was they learned later that one of the smoke jumpers was not Christian. He was Jewish. And so they realized that that was an error, that he was marked, his grave was marked with a cross. But this is the Gisborne, and it looks, that is Mann Gulch. You're looking up into Mann Gulch from there. This I want to share for 2 reasons. One is the obvious, which is this is the marker that it's not a permanent marker. Obviously, it's a board, and every so often somebody comes back and rebuilds it. But this is where Wag Dodge is assumed to have set his escape fire. The other reason is to show the steepness of the hillside, which in places, as Maclean says, is about 70% grade. And having been there, let me tell you, it is a brutal, to turn and try and go straight uphill is brutally tough. A gentleman who took me by boat, the one day I did, you could take the tour boat and get dropped off, or you could pay extra and just get taken straight up without a tour and dropped. And the gentleman who did that for me told me that he frequently led groups in to Mann Gulch, researchers and others. In one case, there was a professional football player, tight end, who was very interested in this fire and wanted to see it for himself. And from about here, he tried to run straight uphill and trying to approximate the time in which Salih and Rumsey did it, and could not even begin to do so. And that was without a wall of fire coming at him to motivate him. But he couldn't do it, and he was an active football player at that time. So the physical conditioning was such he still couldn't do it. This is a familiar shot. You'll see a lot of this angle. This is the Stanley Reba Memorial. Again, showing you just how steep it was that they were trying to get up. One of the things we want to talk about a little bit is the commemoration. And this year being the 75th, that's what motivated us to have this webinar. But there's this poster. There's also a beer that's been manufactured using this artwork that you can purchase. And I think proceeds go to maybe the Smoke Jumpers Fund. I'm not sure, but it's just interesting that this type of commemoration or memorialization does take place, tied to merchandise. Again, just showing the terrain. I did want to show that it's not a smooth hill. There are these depressions, and I'm just adding a little more information. If you're reading Maclean, you can also see how devoid Mann Gulch is now of timber, but from multiple fires. But just that this helped me realize that these, as they were doing, had reversed course and were coming out, how easy it would have been to lose sight of of Wag Dodge in the lead. And how if he bent down to start a fire, how he might not have been seen doing it at all. So with that, I'll stop sharing. So a couple of things I want to add, which is in Maclean's story, he talks about Bud Moore, and Steve, you brought him up. The two of them were neighbors. They knew each other a long time. Bud was the fire expert that Maclean turned to, but they were close friends. There's just this one story that I was fortunate enough to meet and spend time with Bud, and he shared with me, which was that Norman had shared the manuscript with him, wanted his feedback, and Bud was a brilliant writer in his own right, as well as understood the fire, the situation. He had been into Mann Gulch. He knew Wag Dodge. Wag stopped jumping after Mann Gulch. And as a supervisor, Bud took him on his staff to give him a job because he was already dying of, I think it was of cancer. But he wanted him to have a job. And so he got to know Wag Dodge. But the point of this anecdote was that Bud had shared or had turned the manuscript back over to Norman and didn't hear from him for months and months and months. And Bud said, I just assumed he was pissed at me. And indeed, there was a day that Norman showed up in Bud's driveway. Bud was out doing some work there. Norman gets out of the car, slams the door, I think, but shouts at him, damn it, Bud, I'm the professor. You're not the professor. And more or less, that was the extent of the conversation. He got back in the car and drove away. This was obviously very personal to Norman, but he also understood, I think, what Bud was doing, which was pushing him towards the being accurate, being truthful, and being true to the story. That's my interpretation. That is not what Bud said. But Steve, you and I were talking about this before, that one thing I haven't seen, and there's a new biography of Norman Maclean that admittedly I skimmed over the weekend. I did not read closely, but I did read enough to see that there's not discussion in the biography, and I don't see it elsewhere, where I think that relationship, that friendship between Bud and Norman had to have had a role or an influence on Norman's writing of the story. And I would love to know, and this is an unanswerable question, unless it's in either of their papers, which fortunately are preserved, but how much influence Bud may have had in the telling of Mann Gulch, beyond the expertise and that feedback and sharing with him what you did about the standing orders in that anecdote, which Norman has in there, that Bud's been called to the Washington office as part of a committee to review practices and protocols. And a former Marine himself, Bud, starts to recall the 10 standing orders. He's like, and he runs outside of the USDA office, the Forest Service headquarters, and finds a Marine standing at a bus stop and grabs him and asks him for the orders, and he recounts them, and he said, okay, great. And so they took those and modified them for the Forest Service. Stuff like that. Anyway, it's all rolled together there. So I'll just sort of open that up there. Steve, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that relationship or other relationships that would have informed Norman's writing here.
I don't know. I heard about the biography and actually ordered a copy from the University of Washington Press about 2 months ago. I'm still waiting for it to come. So
coming by Pony Express.
Yeah, who knows? I think Maclean valued his time in the Forest Service and valued people who had lived in the woods and wanted to keep that. And part of the power of Young Men in Fire is what I think of as his woodsman's voice, the crusty old guy who's seen it and knows it and tells it sort of like it is, with this wonderful colloquial tone and everyday language without the profanity. But otherwise that and that really brings, and I think that was important for him to maintain those connections and to remember that and not be a University of Chicago professor of Renaissance literature. That scaffolding is all buried in the book. So there's rhetorical structure, there are themes, there are topics, but he manages to filter out all of the formality and speak in a sense as he would imagine as though we were talking to Bud Moore or someone equivalent. So I think that Moore was probably, he had more insight and maybe as part of his audience. But I don't know that the particulars mattered. And it was so hard to find the details of the book. I mean, the book is not, quote, the true story of Mann Gulch. It's the search for the story.
Yeah.
And it's not even the narrative. It is the imperative to find a working narrative that will give some meaning to it. And so it's his quest. And Maclean tries literature, he tries art, he tries science, he tries politics, all these different ways of framing and understanding it. But what he's ultimately driven back on is his own quest, which in a sense, and I think it poignant and powerful that he doesn't complete it. He dies before it's finished. And one of the most touching passages in the book is when at the end, he describes the smoke jumpers as having been hit by a wall of flame or searing air, and then having gotten up and made a final lurch as though they were trying to continue even afterwards what they had started to do when they were alive. And that seemed to me a metaphor, that became for me a metaphor for the book, that it survived him and others were managed to get it into print, thank heaven.
Yeah.
And
I'll expand a little bit on that, not only does he share that, but he says that he had independent confirmation from the doctor and somebody else who saw the bodies in place that they were all facing eastward. And you can read, given his religious beliefs, now he's not Muslim, he's not bowing and praying and facing east. But that's how I read that too. There's that little bit of spiritual religious aspect just there and throughout as well.
Well, his father was a Presbyterian minister, and there's a lot of theology in this. And even though not all of it is necessarily Protestant, I mean, he talks about the Stations of the Cross. He talks about, again, he's looking east towards the Holy Land, and that other son who asked that the burden be relieved, but not. But accepting it. And so there's a lot of that, this whole business about the smoke jumpers being elite with a capital E, he's clearly intending that to be elect. These were those who thought that they were spared the flames of perdition, that they were the chosen. And it turns out two of them survive for reasons they can't explain. Why them? Was it just an act of random providence or reasons we can't explain? And that's why so much of the story, so again, this goes over and over, and why I think Dodge's escape fire was so powerful, because Dodge refuted a sense of predestination or predetermination. The rest died or lived for reasons they couldn't explain. Dodge, in an act of his own hands and mind, created a sanctuary for himself. He created a refuge. It was literally an escape from what would have been predetermined by the geography and the history and all the other stuff that's converging at Mann Gulch. And so it was vital to know that Dodge's escape fire did not kill others. So it doesn't work if his fire means that others died either from his fire or were prevented from escaping.
Mhm.
He has to have an autonomous escape. I mean, that's part of how I read the underlying theology. In this case, you can take the spiritual element out of it, but you're still left with the structure of the narrative, the ideas, however much secularized the smoke jumping experience may have made that. So that's all over the book, and that's part of what helps to underpin, I think, its seriousness,
Mhm.
despite his colloquial language and talks about screw ups and all this other stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting contrasting that with his essay of, was it Fire in 1919? I can't remember the exact.
Oh, the Ranger, the Cook, and the Hole in the Sky.
Yeah, where I mean it's very profane.
Yeah.
That he steers consciously, I have to imagine, away from that in this case because it's a very different subject matter. But yeah, that's those contrasts. And if for folks, if you haven't read that and it's in the A River Runs Through It and other essays, do read that as well. That you'll see another side of Maclean
Yeah.
with that. Um,
It's a delightful story. It was also made into a nice movie. Um, that's well worth watching. And that's the other story of fire. The fire is a coming of age story. It's a coming of age story for
mhm,
him. And
mhm.
there's some fire in the background, and fire's sort of a presence, but it's not a driving feature.
Yeah. I didn't realize that had been made into a film. Do you remember
Yeah.
the name? Is it,
Yeah, the Ranger, the Cook, and the Hole in the Sky.
oh, it is called that. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I've got a DVD of it. It's out there.
Okay. Do you want to take some questions?
Sure.
Okay. Mac McClure, uh, he's looking for a little more background at the time of the fire. Asks, were the steep slopes covered with more tree vegetation at the time of the fire, or was it much as it is today?
Uh, there appears to have been um, more tree growth of various heights there, but this was a south-facing slope, and it was primarily grass and a few low shrubs. And that's what appears to be the case if you look at the photos that were taken during the body retrieval and the post-fire surveys. That it is primarily grass. It was the hottest day on record up to then in Helena, Montana. August 5th, I mean, prime fire weather, unstable air. One of the crew that was originally sent to jump on the fire got airsick and didn't jump. And that was taken by Gisborne and others as evidence. Well, the unstable air, so it could support a blow up if a plume gets started. So all of that was in favor. Everything was in favor of a fire if it got started at the bottom.
And they were in the timber when they turned around and they were coming out of the timber. Dodge is now at the head of the pack, if you will. And they emerge from the timber and see him in the grass. So, and that's part of it. But yeah, it's not, the photos we shared with you today don't show where, at least mine didn't get down to where the turnaround point is. But yeah, it is slick grass. Maclean talks about trying to scramble up the hill, and you needed one hand to grab grass for grip as they're running the tape measure out, and one hand holding the tape measure. He also makes the mistake of wearing slick bottom boots, which
Yeah.
but nevertheless, so Mac, it's that was the situation.
Yeah. You see a lot of timber in the photos that we were taking, looking it over, but that's all on the north facing side. So and it would have been the same at the time. There was some timber, but not as dense as what you see on the north side.
Mhm.
And that has been scrubbed clean recently by several fires. So I think for timber to come back there would be a surprise.
Mhm. Robert Lewin says, I must believe that your book, Steve, Fire in America, had an influence on both Norman and John Maclean's books. And he's asking for your reflections on that.
Well, that would be a marvelous fact if it were true. I I I I learned when I was researching for Fire in America. I was in Missoula in the fall of 1977 and looking at fire records, and there was a shelf of the Mann Gulch fire, and they were all in perfect, pristine order. And that was because Maclean had already gone through there with the help of the librarian archivist for that. All that was, and I just photocopied the whole thing.
Hmm.
So I learned that he was working on it. And I spent an academic year at the National Humanities Center in North Carolina, doing a lot of the writing for what became Fire in America. And I learned there the people there knew that Norman Maclean was writing this. He was a celebrity writer because of a river runs through it, and he was known. And so I backed off, even though I had the full records, from dealing very much with it in Fire in America because I figured he was going to have it first, and I didn't want to be. I wanted to put my effort elsewhere, so I only had a small section in the book that came out. Um, so my book was published in '82. Uh, I, as far as I can tell, Maclean was through with his research by then, and um, was unable to finish it. So I can't. I would like to think that Fire in America gave an extra jolt to it, but his book was not about fire in the way that mine was. It was about using fire to talk about other stuff. And so I do think that Fire in America influenced some of John Maclean's subsequent stuff. I've been on a panel with him, and he made some motion to that in the sense that it helped provide background history for him. But I think the impetus was all Norman's stuff and following that example.
Okay. Joe Royce over at NC State asks, what was learned from studying the Mann Gulch fire that was not known in 1949? That's what comes to mind, Joe, is you could write a book on that alone. But
that would be that's a great question. I don't think much. I think they knew enough. What happened was that they were surprised by the spot fires. Everything they did was more or less on protocol. The spot fires, for whatever reason, however it happened, these spot fires got started down at the mouth and then had a huge fetch of tight wind and expansive grass to go on. And that's a great formula for fire. They knew that. Everybody knew that. I don't think that more fire research would have helped. And we might have asked, well, why didn't more fire research help at South Canyon? Why didn't more fire research help at Yarnell Hill? It's not, I don't see that research would have informed a significant change. What would have made a change was a change in policy that says when conditions are lined up like they were, nobody should be out there. And we're not ready to make that call yet. We're moving in that some directions. This use of managed wildfires and stuff is really great. The Southwest is a wonderful region for this. They're doing some really marvelous stuff. But what it would take to prevent these tragedies is not being there under those conditions. And we don't need more expansive computer modeling of plume development and pyrocumulus to know that. We've known that for a long time. And it's, yeah.
I think in the case of South Canyon, if I recall correctly, it wasn't that fire research science was going to make a difference. It was, in their case, a breakdown of communication. It was a human problem, not a fire problem, if you will.
Well, I think, yeah, there was a forecast. There was a cold front moving through. That was a dynamic here in the wind shift, and that had been known earlier. There was a message that was supposed to go out, and didn't get there in time, so there was a breakdown. But why are you on a steep slope covered with primarily shrubs and grass, south facing? Everything's in its favor, and then spot fires start below. That's exactly what happened. In this case, you can't outrun the fire in the same way. So this is not a blame game. Should they have known? We've known undercut lines are not good practice. A lot of things have improved since then, but I don't know that a shift in science would have changed that.
Yeah.
And I'm not dismissing the science. I love all this stuff. I'm all for more of it for various reasons. But fundamentally knowing, and then if we fine tune it, well, that would have allowed us to get another hour of work line cutting before we left. No, we knew that these are extreme conditions. Nobody should be out there.
Clark Seeley asks, well, Clark, I appreciate that he's teeing this up for us. First of all, he thanks us for the presentation. And I have full disclosure, Clark is our current board chair, which that is not why I'm taking it. It's more that he, like I said, he's teed us up, which is where might we find your essay that you wrote from the site when you visited. Steve, I'll let you plug that book, but I will say that we're going to be reprinting it in the next issue of our magazine, Forest History Today. So it appeared originally in which book of yours?
A short book called The Northern Rockies, A Fire Survey. I had a chance to bring Fire in America up to date in a sense. So I started in 1960 and went up to 2013, a book called Between Two Fires. And I took that as sort of a play-by-play account of what has happened in American fires. But I wanted what I thought of as a color commentary essays to go with that, to capture some detail. And those wound up resulting in a series of 9 regional short, say 55 to 60,000 word collections of essays framing the region. And it is in the Northern Rockies region of that. So the Northern Rockies, a fire survey. It also has a little section on the generational changes from involving Bud Moore, Bob Much, and others, how that experience gets translated down through generations. And that has really been a distinctive feature, I think, of the Northern Rockies. Other regions sometimes have, well, my granddad taught me how to burn here in the Southeast, or others, I went out with my dad fighting fire in California and the rest of it. But this generational shift is very powerful in Young Men in Fire. And I had another essay looking at that as a regional phenomenon. So
yeah, and Bud Moore's if you will, a common narrative thread through all of this, because his career was so long and his involvement was so central. He just shows up in these different places. It's not always fire, but central to Forest Service history. But his book on the lock saw is a beautiful book and well worth trying. It's still in print, so it's not as if it's hard to find. His is worth. I equate that to it's like the Northern Rockies, a Sand County Almanac, but in his case, he also is. Although he spent his career at the Forest Service, he did not hesitate to criticize the Forest Service for the turns and decisions it made in the 60s and 70s. So
he is also remarkable as someone whose career had been built on fire for so much and so long at a fundamental level. I mean, he didn't even graduate from elementary school. I mean, it's a remarkable career,
8th grade education.
A very American sort of career in that sense. But he made the transition from fire suppression to fire restoration with his work again in the Bitterroot Selway and the rest. He helped to give a kind of, if not official imprimatur to this, a sense that it's okay. Here's somebody who represents our heritage in fire, which is very strong in the Northern Rockies, big fires in a big landscape.
Mhm.
But he's one who's arguing we need to get these natural fires back in there, and was willing to help promote it. And so he was fundamental in making, and that was really a hard transition for a lot of people.
It was. He was involved. He had retired, and they kind of looped him in when they started doing the let burn policy experiments. There was the Eagle Cap Wilderness.
The
Uh,
Whitecap, yeah.
Wait, okay. So you'd think I would know off the top of my head because we have an article in one of our issues of Forest History Today about that group, that experiment. The names you shared: Bob Much, Orville Daniels, Bud Moore. Bud was the fire guru that I don't know that if he had said no, I don't want to be involved, if they would have gotten uh, anywhere with that experiment. I don't know if it would have gotten off the ground. Um, so with that, so there's that relationship as we've been talking about. George Ducker asked if we could talk a little bit about the relationship between Maclean and Laird Robinson, and how the latter was instrumental in helping put the research for the book together. Do you have any insights on that?
Just what's in the book. And again, I thought that was interesting. That the generation Maclean speaks about what a pleasure it was to have a younger guy to accompany him. And I'm thinking, okay, this is sort of like a graduate student out in the woods, may have been the academic equivalent, but there was that generation which mattered to Maclean. And that's about all I can say. I haven't researched it. I haven't done anything special. I've never met Laird Robinson. I don't know. I can't contribute anything. Perhaps you and your oral interviews your oral histories have picked up something.
I haven't, but I will say that in the new biography, it's clear that he enjoyed working with younger students. In fact, the
Yeah.
author of the biography is somebody who he had befriended when she was in high school and
Ah,
persuaded. She was from South Carolina. I think she was visiting her brother out in Montana one summer. She was 15, 16 years old, and befriended Maclean, and she was a poet, and he encouraged and nurtured the poet in her, and then kind of recruited her to come to the University of Chicago. She does have a wonderful story in there about her first trip to Chicago in the dead of winter. And this is somebody from South Carolina that she was so ill prepared, but she was just taken under his wing, and that it was, and this was ultimately what leads to her writing the biography of him. But that he did this time and again. He worked with younger people.
yeah,
So that's how I can contextualize the relationship with Laird.
yeah.
Um, I can't say that he and Bud Moore were roughly contemporaries. So, um, but there was just time and again with Maclean, there's that uh, outreach to younger folks. But he also didn't suffer fools, so he wasn't going to do this for anybody or everybody. It's if he saw promise in you and liked you, and it seems your work ethic as well, and a willingness to put up with him. um, so, and Joe Royce asks, he chimes in again to ask if we think that Rothermel, whose first name flies out of my head, but worked on this and published a scientific paper about the fire, if
Mhm.
the influence that Maclean and young men might have had on Rothermel. Any thoughts or insights on that?
Well, my understanding is that Maclean, as part of his research, went to the fire lab, which is in Missoula,
Mhm.
and tried to learn what he could about why the fire behaved the way it did. And they took up the cause as a kind of interesting fire behavior question. Both the Dick Rothermel, who produced the first mathematical model basically for fire spread, it came out early 70s, 71, 72. And Frank Albini, who was really a genius, had this and came up with these famous nomograms. And if you know about them, you'll be nodding your head yes. And if you don't worry about it. And they became interested in it, and that produced a paper, which Maclean then uses, because Maclean, as a scholar of Renaissance literature, was particularly interested in tragedy. And this became the graph between the rate of spread of the fire and the rate of movement of the crew becomes a scientific sort of rational illustration of tragedy. Here they are matching their will against fate. And so that becomes one of his attempts at explaining it, along with art and literature and other forms. And that in turn, so then we see the same thing happen after South Canyon. The lab puts together a crew. They're going to go. This becomes, just as John Maclean has taken up the cause of writing about these multiple fatality fires, the lab has taken up the cause of explaining the physics behind it, which is all great. And we see that continuing into Yarnell Hill and others. So I think my understanding is that was prompted by Maclean's quest and their attempt to answer his question.
And my sense is, and you've alluded to, if not outright said, that this fire probably would have disappeared. Tragic as it is, it would have fallen off the radar, if not from Maclean. And that just speaks to the power of his work, and his voice as well. The fact that he's in the story, it's very personal.
Yeah,
just adds so many more layers to it. Whereas his son's account of South Canyon, I don't recall John inserting himself into the story, because, as you said, in Norman's case, it's a quest. It's a search for answers of the truth and what happened. And I think most everyone watching today also knows it's him grappling with his own mortality throughout. Whereas with John, John's background was as a journalist, and he's reporting it as best he can recreate and understand it as well.
And I also have sympathy. I mean, John has done a real service to the fire community by producing this book, because nobody else was doing it. Why would you take it on at that time? Well, he took it on because he had to work through his father's manuscript and now could continue. But I also marvel what a enormous burden it would have to be to produce books like this after your father's success with Young Men in Fire. How can you do this? Is he going to put himself in? No, I don't think he can, because his father did. I mean, there's also a literary that relationship itself would, for me, be so forbidding. I wouldn't go anywhere near it. I would go at it sideways. I would do something else. But he's taken it on, and we've all benefited from that. But I also think we have to grant him his own style and voice.
Yeah.
I can't imagine. That's the kind of thing I just walk away from those. I'm not going to take this on.
Well, I know I obviously can't put myself in John's shoes. I know how, just like rereading over the last week, rereading Young Men in Fire, how emotionally difficult revisiting that story was. And that, which is ultimately what led me to go there, was I read it.
Yeah.
Like, I'm from the East. We don't have mountains like they do in the Northern Rockies. And so to understand the terrain, I felt like I had to go there. And shameless plug time, I've been the two times I've been. So there was one day, and then a year or so later, I went on back-to-back days. But both times I came out of there just emotionally wrung out. There's the physical demands of being there, but standing in those places is really hard. And so I can't imagine the challenge John faced in trying to recreate the South Canyon fire. And I think he's got one or two other books. The fortitude that he has to do that is just, I can understand why too, as somebody who's fought fire, you spent your early years on fire crews, how you would just, it sounds like you opted to stay away from the personal stories. You have your own reasons, which I won't speculate on, but anyway, I'm kind of drifting a little. But that's I guess what I'm ultimately getting at is the emotional power of Maclean's story tied to what happened there. And then to be there is emotionally overwhelming as well.
Yeah. I have been to all the multiple fatality fire sites that I showed in the graph, except for the Hauser Creek one, which is Pendleton, an area. So I wasn't, that had different access.
Mhm.
And none of those had the effect that going to Mann Gulch had. And the reason was I had Maclean's book in my head,
Mhm.
and I was seeing it through that curious prism that he presented. And part of his voice is still in my head as I'm going through that. Yeah, I mean, Blackwater fire was devastating was the CCC crew, and they actually created some medals to honor
Mm.
these people, but nobody knows about it. I mean, it's not easy to even. There's a sign near the highway nearby, but you're not going to get there's we haven't. I've been to these other sites and nothing equivalent. I have been to Yarnell, which is a little different because I could see the smoke from my house. I was living in North Glendale, Phoenix metro area, and I actually could see a little bit of the, not knowing what it was, just welcoming it as cutting off a few degrees from the temperature that day, and then learned later.
Yeah.
And that I became more engaged in. But for the most part, you're right. I have not tried to write it personally. In these essays, this collection, the color commentary, I have. And I wrote, actually, it was published in '89, so 3 years before Young Men in Fire. I wrote a kind of memoir, my life on a fire crew. I thought of it at the time. Memoir wasn't a big thing at that time, and I thought of it as the autobiography of a crew. So yeah, I tell the story, but I hide myself in it a lot. It's not about me; it's about what this life was like. Um, and I'm very pleased with it. And but for the most part, I'm not interested in the confessional style. I'm not interested in my personal question. I don't think I'm that strong a vessel to carry it all.
Mhm.
Um, for whatever reasons, I'm not. In the essays, I do, partly because I've seen the power of Maclean's book that, yeah, if you do this, um, you can engage the audience better, and you're forcing yourself to go into things that otherwise you'd just shy away from. I don't want to get into that. And in this case, I do.
Mhm.
And now it's become more common. I also learned from some of Wallace Stegner's essays, um, where he put himself in an indirect way, that's a very powerful technique, and I've been interested in that. And I was also interested in some of Joan Didion's stuff, but she gets too much into the personal, using that to reveal stuff about herself, which does not interest me.
Mhm.
So, but certainly in Fire in America or Between Two Fires, or other national fire histories, I've shied away from it.
Okay. Muriel Moore asks, how does this time relate to today's Western fires? And Muriel, I'm going to say, I assume you're referring to Mann Gulch. So I'll phrase it that way. How does Mann Gulch relate to today's Western fires?
Well, I think even in 1949, you could have big fires. And we should remember that in the late 19th century, particularly as the railroad began opening up large territories in forested areas, the Old North Woods and beyond, we had serial megafires, an order of magnitude larger and more lethal than what we've seen in recent years. And this is at the end of the Little Ice Age, essentially. What you need is a short period of intense warming, what we might today call a heat dome, 19th, early 20th century style, on massive amounts of fuel, primarily logging slash and land clearing slash. And that's enough to cause it. So we can have big fires then. We can certainly have big fires now. Now we can add climate change. We've also had since Mann Gulch, 75 years of fuel buildup. Now at Mann Gulch itself, this succession of fires has pretty much cleaned out that south slope, but there's plenty to burn, as the Meriwether fire showed. And we've got more of that. So the situation is more intense than it was then. I think we've learned a lot about policy. I mean, we spent, after 1910, which in many ways makes a convenient origin story for the modern American wildland firefighting or style, we spent 50 years trying to take fire out of all landscapes. And since then, the late 60s, 68 through 78, we've spent 50 years trying to put good fire back in. And it turns out it's a lot easier to take it out than to put it back. I mean, it's a lot easier to kill off wolves than to reintroduce wolves at scale. And to their credit, the agencies are doing it. And it's expanding into private lands, but it's really tough. And it's going to be a whole lot tougher. And so I think the future about this is really, where do we want to fight them? Where and when do we want to light them? Where do we just say, this fire is out of our control and we could spend $1 billion on it and put a lot of lives and equipment at risk, and it's not going to make a hill of beans worth of difference, and we're just going to tear up a lot of landscape trying. Mm-hmm. And that is a social decision that I don't think we're quite there yet, but I'm astonished at the number of artists, poets, and writers who would not, by their background, in any way be interested in fire, who are now engaging with it or have engaged with it in some ways. There is a cultural connection that did not exist in 1949. And I think Maclean is in many ways the model for how that can work. And the rest of us are sort of in his slipstream as far as creating the literature. The rest of it, I mean, I've done different kinds of things. When I wrote my account of life on a fire crew, the original title was Flame and Fortune, because that was our crew motto: money and action. I mean, that's what it is. The best of all. Yeah, how could you not love this? And it was great. It was not an existential risk at every time we went out. I mean, we were initial attack firefighters, smoke chasers, really. The biggest problem was finding the fire more often than not. And we were very effective at getting them out. And that got washed out. So it became Fire in the Rim because the marketing department wouldn't, the publisher decided they were not going to market a book with that pun in the title. So I've been bitter about that ever since, but nonetheless. But that is a very different world. You look back now at the North Rim, they've got modern stuff, modern equipment. It's a different world. The world of firefighting, the world of fire management, the world of fire is completely different than it was. My last season was 81. I was actually acting fire officer for Grand Canyon National Park at the time as a seasonal, which that was sort of the peak of my seasonal career. I spent 85 at Yellowstone, and I got on a fire. That was my last active fire. So I've been out of it for 40 plus years on the fire line. But believe me, this really has changed. I mean, the old looking back, oh, it was better back then. It really was easier back then. We didn't think it was easy. And people in the fire community didn't think it was easy. And they were wrestling with what does it mean to junk the 10 a.m. policy and go to putting fire back in? How do we do it? What kind of political, social, bureaucratic space have we got to be able to do this? We know there are going to be errors and mistakes. What's going to happen? All of that. None of these were easy questions, but the fires themselves, yeah, and you did have big bad fires and blowups, but generally the whole fire scene is so much more savage now than it was then, that being on a fire crew has got to mean something different. And we could do it seasonally.
Yeah.
And it's getting harder now because seasons are longer. And
Yeah. And
it's
Jay
just
Taylor brings up the exurbanation or wildland urban
yeah,
interface issue. And he asks, how does the problem of defensive property complicate firefighting strategy? I'm not asking rhetorically, but I mean, it does. He's right. It does complicate it a great deal, and there's yet to be that conversation or that reckoning.
yeah. Well, part of my interpretation here is that problem, that issue got misdefined at the beginning, back in the mid 80s, actually.
Okay.
And it got defined by the wildland fire community, which saw housing and urban development encroaching on their ability to manage fire in wildlands. But in many ways, you could pick up the other end of that stick and say, really, this is an urban fire problem with peculiar landscaping. And if you define it as a wildland fire problem, it's a wicked problem, as scientists like to say. It's really insoluble.
Mhm.
If you define it as an urban fire problem, it's pretty clear what you have to do. You treat these small enclaves, ex-urban, they may think of themselves as being out in the woods, and they have wooded areas around them, but they are an urban community living on an urban service economy for the most part. And they need to be treated as such from a fire perspective. And that's where you protect the communities. And trying to solve that problem by wildlands, particularly in forested areas, has not gotten, there's no, it has not solved it in a way. And so often you see these aerial views of the community burned down to melted cars and concrete slabs, but the trees around it are fine.
Mhm.
Or some of the worst fires we've had, the Marshall fire in Colorado was grassland. The Maui fire, it was grassland, abandoned agricultural land. So these are really urban settings that need to be redefined, not primarily as wildland. But the guy posing the question is exactly right. This has complicated enormously what you can do. It shrunk your geographic space because you've also got to deal with smoke in these communities as well. Your social license, your bureaucratic space, your political space. Anything goes wrong and a community gets under threat or gets smoked in, you got big trouble.
Yeah. Well, Steve, I want to thank you very much for your time and your insights. Thoroughly enjoyed this.